Hello and welcome to the podcast. This is Ron's Amazing Stories, where we play tales to take you away from today. On the podcast this week, we take a walk on the Wildside with Eros, the god of love. Add in some stories about a staged murder, a shadow man encounter, and we even return to the Adolphus Hotel for round 2.
No way.
Mark is back with Chapter 5 of Anything You Can Do, and Tom has another incredible edition of Growing Up.
Wow!
I know, I can hardly believe it myself, and it all begins with this 5-minute mystery.
Another 5-minute mystery.
This 5-minute mystery is being brought to you by The Show Must Go On. In the face of danger, accident, or even murder, that mantra has never been more true. How will we use this phrase today? Let's listen in.
Well, okay, on stage, everybody. Curtain going up for Act 2. Everything ready, Mr. Roberts?
All set, Jerry.
Okay, boys and girls, on stage. Ready? Stage light.
Hold it, Johnny. Hold that curtain.
What's the matter with you, Mac? You're hired to watch the stage door, not to hold up production.
Just the same, Johnny, you're holding that curtain till the cops arrive. Girl was just found murdered in the star's dressing room.
Murder, all right. Plain, cold-blooded murder. Cruel blow in the temple. Anybody know who she is?
Oh, she's one of the chorus line, Inspector, Sybil Lang.
I see. Mr. Roberts, I understand this is your dressing room.
That's right, Inspector, it is. Ghastly mess, isn't it?
Mr. Roberts is Johnny Roberts, Inspector, the noted tap dancer. Being the star of this show, we gave him the big room.
And you were on stage at the time the murder was discovered, Mr. Roberts?
Well, practically. I've been standing in the wings waiting for curtain.
Pardon me, Inspector, but that crowd out there is growing impatient. As long as no one can leave, I see no reason for holding curtain. People have paid plenty to get a look at Roberts.
Well, I suppose there's no harm. The show must go on.
I say, Inspector, that's sporting of you. I'll be back in 5 minutes.
The thing that gets me, Mac here swears no one left the theater all evening.
I'd vouch for that too, Inspector. You see, as producer, it's my business to keep tab on the cast.
That means the murderer is still among us. But where, then, did he dispose of the weapon? He wouldn't have risked being caught leaving the room with it on him. We've searched everywhere, and there isn't a sign of anything heavy enough to administer that death blow.
Why would a pretty girl like that be in a mess like this, anyway?
Mr. Roberts!
Confound these boisterous audiences. Oh, there you are, Jerry.
Well, what is it, Roberts? What's the crowd kicking up about?
Look here, Jerry. A star is entitled to some rights. I tell you I won't have it. They're insisting, demanding I dance. Now, you promised me. Well, it says in the contract I MC this show. No audience is going to railroad me.
You don't mean you're going against audience will, Mr. Roberts. I thought it was the public that makes or breaks you.
Not John Roberts. I'll tear up my contract first. I'll tear it up.
That won't be necessary, Mr. Roberts. That contract is going to be broken anyway. John Roberts, I arrest you for the murder of Sybil Lang.
Why did the inspector arrest John Roberts? Do you know the clue? In just a moment, we'll hear more, but first...
Okay, this one's a real puzzler. However, I do find it odd that there was nothing on the stage that could have been used as a murder weapon. I have the distinct feeling that this murder is going to come down to that fact. Also, why won't the guy dance? And why do we need to know about it?
And now let's see what the inspector has to say. What are you talking about? You can't arrest me. I'll sue.
Just a minute, Roberts. Why did you just refuse to dance when that audience gave you that commanding ovation? You're wearing tap shoes, so you can't say you weren't prepared.
Well, I didn't want to dance, that's why.
Oh, no, Mr. Roberts. I'll tell you why you refused. You couldn't dance. Those loaded taps you put on the tap shoes you're wearing are too heavy for nimble dancing. But they weren't too heavy to deal a death blow. You killed Sybil Lang. You might have walked away with the clue. Just literally walked right off with it. If that audience hadn't wanted to see John Roberts go into his act. Now I suggest you hand those shoes over as Exhibit A. You might find them a little too heavy when you walk the last mile.
Well, I guess that's a first. He almost tap danced his way through this one. I guess he really did have a really big shoe. Of course I meant show. It was kind of a grisly picture there towards the end, wasn't it? Oh well, this 5-minute mystery was brought to you by The Show Must Go On. Some confusion this week. The main point of contact for the show is ronsamazingstories.com. However, there is a blog site. It is tied in and has caused some confusion with folks. It is ronsamazingstories.blog. That is me, us, and it houses the blog and story page. You can subscribe to it via email, and it is a great way to follow the show. Not only do you get the podcast notifications, but the weekly blog itself. For you experts, yes, there is an RSS feed for it, and the address is available on the main site. I get a lot of friend requests on my personal Facebook page. I don't reply to these, but it does make me feel kind of bad when I don't. So I wanted to remind you that we do have a Ron's Amazing Stories Facebook fan page. This is a great place to go to learn about the show and interact with me. You also have the added benefit of talking to others who listen to the program. Right now there are about 150-ish people there, and it is an open membership, so you can post right away. There are links to it on the main website, ronsamazingstories.com, or you can search for the show on Facebook. Please join us. I would love for that place to blow up and have conversations with you guys. I received this email from David Larson. I looked for the podcast survey on my mobile device. However, I couldn't find the link. On further inspection, I looked on my computer, and lo and behold, there it was on the sidebar. So I think if you had another hyperlink to it that could be accessed from a mobile device, you might get more people to take it. David. Well, thank you for that, David. And you are quite right about that. It is there on your phone, but you have to scroll through every single episode to get to it. That's over 200 shows, and that just won't do. So, starting with this podcast, you will see a link in the show notes for the Ron's Amazing Stories survey. My apologies for that one. By the way, the survey takes about 5 minutes to complete and asks questions about you but requires no personal information. You can find the link to the survey in the show notes, and it will help the podcast. I will share some of the results with you in an upcoming blog post after we get some more surveys done. I want to thank you guys. You have been responding to my request for military stories, but I still need a few more. I'm planning a special Armed Forces episode of the podcast. So if you have a story to share on the subject, please head to ronsamazingstories.com and click on that story submission banner. By the way, starting this week, that link will also be in the show notes at the bottom. And now, these are your stories.
These are your stories, sent by you, for you.
Our first story comes from Cairo and not the one in Illinois. Allie Frost now lives in Egypt, but is originally from New York. She is a historical librarian, and I can't think of a better place to research history than there. Allie writes, "My brother sent me your podcast because he thought I would love it. I do, and I'm now a big fan. I've never gotten a good answer to my story, and I would love to have your thoughts on it. This happened to me one night when I was a little girl in New York, lying in bed with all the lights off. I was all wrapped up in my blanket, all nice and warm, and was drifting off to sleep, even though I really wasn't tired. It was only 8:30 p.m. I was thinking about angels because I had just got a book from my Nana about them, and it said that my guardian's name was Cupid. I was wondering if that was true or not when I was startled by a strange voice whispering in my left ear, and it clearly said, 'Cupid.' The next morning I asked my sister if she had seen or heard anything the night before. She said no. I figured it was just my imagination, and I went to wash up. Just as I was finishing up, I turned and saw a dark figure standing right in front of me. I was so afraid that I ran straight through it into my bedroom and jumped under the covers. I felt woozy, and I needed help standing when my mother came to check on me. She tried to comfort me and told me that my Nana's stories had got the better of me. She kept me home from school that day, and I never left her side. It never happened again, and to this day, thinking about that black figure brings back terrors that I just can't explain. I have never gotten a good answer to what I experienced, so please, if you or anyone has any answers, I'd be happy to read them and will join in the conversation. Finally, thank you for reading my story, Allie Frost, Cairo, Egypt." Well, Allie, that is a terrifying account. If you were to ask me, I don't think your encounter had anything to do with your Nana or the book on angels, although I won't discount it. Here is a little background. The mention of Cupid typically conjures up images of a cherub-winged infant wielding a bow and arrow, but this wasn't always the case. Long before the Romans adopted and renamed him Cupid, he was known to the Greeks as Eros, the god of love. One of the first authors to mention Eros, circa 700 BC, was Hesiod, who described him as one of the primal deities born of the world egg. Armed with bow and quiver, filled with both golden arrows to arouse desire and leaden arrows to ignite aversion, Eros struck at the hearts of gods and mortals and played with their emotions. In one story, Cupid, Eros, shot a golden arrow at Apollo. He immediately fell in love with a nymph named Daphne. Then Eros launched a leaden arrow at Daphne so that she would be repulsed by him. Well, as you can imagine, chaos ensued. In my research, nothing indicates that Cupid would be a negative entity. However, he was known for being chaotic. If I had to guess, what you came up against was a shadow person. I've not heard that a lot of shadow people communicate, so I would say that this was a rare encounter, or maybe it's not connected to the whispers at all. I do believe your story because I personally have had a shadow person encounter myself. Mine was in broad daylight, bright sunny day, and my sister's dog, who was with me, reacted to it as well. I do want to thank you for your story, and if any of you have a take on this, please let us know. Maybe on the Facebook fan page? Thank you for your story, Allie. Our second story is a short one from Mercy B. I asked Mercy if her parents knew what they were doing when they named her. She said her sister's name is Hope, but her brother's name is Brian. I guess I was just being too whimsical. But hey, here is her story. Hi, Ron. I have a short but true tale that happened to me a couple years ago. I am an eBay valet, and what I do is take items from people and sell them on eBay for them. I have a set fee and also take a percentage of the price. I specialize in antiques. One afternoon, I was on my way to a client's home to pick up her collection of old radios. I use GPS a lot to make sure I get where I'm going. I entered the client's address and followed the instructions. While on the route, I felt funny. I don't know how else to describe it. I just did. When I arrived, I saw it was the cutest farmhouse ever. The area was well kept up, and everything was done up like it were the late 1940s. I remember thinking that this person truly is an amazing collector. There was even an old butter churn on the porch that looked like it was brand new and that it had just been used for the first time. I knocked on the door and didn't get an answer. I waited there for about 10 minutes, pulled out one of my business cards and wrote, "Sorry I missed you." Annoyed, I grabbed my cell phone to call home, but noticed the battery was completely drained. I got back in the car and drove home. When I arrived, my roommate asked where I had been, and I told him. He said, "Some woman called and wondered why you didn't pick up the radios." I took the message. I called her back and told the client my story. She said that she had been there all day and that I had not shown up or left a card. I told her that I must have gone to the wrong place and that I would be there in half an hour. I followed the same exact route before, but this time the old farmhouse was replaced with an ultra-modern domed house. I thought, wow, I really went to the wrong place, and apologized to my client. We loaded up the radios, and I was about to leave when I saw an old oak tree. I made the comment that the place I went to had a similar tree. She looked at me funny and asked me to follow her inside. She showed me a picture of an old home. It was the exact same house that I had been at earlier. I said, "That's it. That's the place I went to. Where is that?" She looked at me and said, "That was the house we tore down to build this place." A chill ran through my body that I will never forget. I don't have any more to say about it except that that's what happened. I, of course, drove all over the area looking for the home, but never found it. To this day, I have no idea what the heck went on. Mercy B., Arkansas. Mercy B., what a story. I recently was listening to a podcast about time warps, but I've never really heard a story that I believed until now. Thank you for sharing, and I certainly don't have any explanation for you. I guess we just have to wonder what the people thought about your business card from the future. Thank you, Mercy. Our last story is a reflection from Stacy Myers. She sends in this comment in reference to episode number 335, The Adolphus Bride. She writes, "Hello, Ron. Thanks for responding to my messed up email from before. When I read it over, I didn't understand it either. I guess I was too excited to even think about typing. I probably should have waited until I had calmed down. I will start all over, and this time I may even proofread it. I, too, have been to the Adolphus Hotel in Dallas, Texas, and had a very strange night there. I was with a friend on a weekend trip, and we'll leave it at that. On our first night, we decided to have room service. We had the perfect view of the city, and we could think of no place that we would rather be. There was a knock on the door. My friend went to answer, and no one was there. Again we went to waiting, and again came a knock on the door. He went, opened it, and again no one was waiting. Getting irritated, he stood by the door and waited for it to knock. The knock came, and he threw open the door with such force that the standing bellman fell over backwards, taking our dinner with him. I laugh now, but the bellman's words were not to be repeated. The knocking stopped after that, but the rest of the night was uneasy. We definitely heard bumps in the night, and at one point the room grew so cold that we had to turn up the heat. By the way, it was July, and yes, we were on the 19th floor. Stacy Myers, Texas. Well, Stacy, thank you for that comment and story. I will point out that Stacy is referring to a story sent in by Dana and Derek a few weeks back in episode number 335 about their experience at the Adolphus Hotel. If you don't remember, a ghost bride is said to haunt the 19th floor. I did a bit more research, and the whole hotel is a hotbed of paranormal activity. It makes me wonder why people stay there, and these were your stories.
And now it's time for another installment of Anything You Can Do by Randall Garrett. The story so far. The alien Nipe has crash-landed his spaceship in Siberia. He immediately disappears. 8 months later, he reappears in Leningrad, having learned to speak Russian. After spending 3 weeks conversing with the staff, when asked about religion, the Nipe suddenly goes crazy, kills 2 people, steals a flyer, and disappears. Now he can be anywhere on the planet. We were also introduced to a young man who had just had twin boys. Why? We don't know. So now it's time for Chapter 5 of Anything You Can Do by Randall Garrett. 2/5 of a second. That was all the time Bart Stanton had from the first moment his super-sensitive ears heard the first faint whisper of metal against leather. He made good use of the time. The noise had come from behind and slightly to the left of him, so he drew his left-hand weapon and spun to the left as he dropped to a crouch. He had turned almost completely around, drawn his gun, and fired 3 shots before the other man had even leveled his own weapon. The bullets from Stanton's gun made 3 round spots on the man's jacket, almost touching each other and directly over the heart. The man blinked stupidly for a moment, looking down at the spots. "My God," he said softly. Then he returned his own weapon slowly to its holster. The big room was noisy. The 3 shots had merely added to the noise of the gunfire that rattled intermittently around the 2 men. And even that gunfire was only a part of the cacophony. The tortured molecules of the air in the room were so besieged by the beat of drums, the blare of trumpets, the crackle of lightning, the rumble of heavy machinery, the squawks and shrieks of horns and whistles, the rustle of autumn leaves, the machine gun snap of popping popcorn, the clink and jingle of falling coins, and the yelps, bellows, howls, roars, snarls, grunts, bleats, moos, purrs, cackles, quacks, chirps, buzzes, and hisses of a myriad of animals, that each molecule would have thought that it was being shoved in 100,000 different directions at once if it had had a mind to think with. The noise wasn't deafening, but it was certainly all-pervasive. Bart Stanton had reholstered his own weapon and half opened his lips to speak when he heard another sound behind him. Again he whirled, his guns in his hands, both of them this time, and his forefingers only fractions of a millimeter from the point that would fire the hair triggers. But he did not fire. The second man had merely shifted the weapons in his holsters and then dropped his hands away. The noise, which had been flooding the room over the speaker system, died instantly. Stanton shoved his guns back into place and rose from his crouch. "Real cute," he said, grinning. "I wasn't expecting that one." The man he was facing smiled back. "Well, Bart, perhaps we have proved our point. What do you think, Colonel?" "Fuck me," was addressed to the third man, who was still standing quietly, looking worried and surprised about the 3 spots on his jacket that had come from the special harmless projectiles in Stanton's gun. Colonel Mannheim was 4 inches shorter than Stanton's 5'10" and was 15 years older. But in spite of the differences, he would have laughed if anyone had told him 5 minutes before that he couldn't outdraw a man who was standing with his back turned. His bright blue eyes, set deep beneath craggy brows and a tanned face, looked speculatively at the younger man. "Incredible," he said gently. "Absolutely incredible." Then he looked at the other man, a lean civilian with mild blue eyes a shade lighter than his own. "All right, Farnsworth, I'm convinced. You and your staff have quite literally created a Superman. Anyone who could stand in a noise-filled room and hear a man draw a gun 20 feet behind him is incredible enough. The fact that he could and did outdraw and outshoot me after I had started, well, that's almost beyond comprehension." He looked back at Bart Stanton. "What's your opinion? Do you think you can handle the Nipe, Stanton?" Stanton paused imperceptibly before answering, while his ultra-fast mind considered the problem before arriving at a decision. Just how much confidence should he show the colonel? Mannheim was a man with tremendous confidence in his own abilities, but who was nevertheless capable of recognizing that there were men who were his superiors in one field or another. "If I can't dispose of the Nipe," Stanton said, "no one can." Colonel Mannheim nodded slowly. "I believe you're right," he said at last. His voice was firm with inner conviction. He shot a glance at Farnsworth. "How about the second man?" Farnsworth shook his head. "He'll never make it. In another 2 years, we can put him into reasonable shape again, but his nervous system just couldn't stand the gaff." "Can we get another man ready in time?" "Hardly. We can't just pick a man up off the street and turn him into a Superman. Even if we could find another subject with Bart's genetic possibilities, it would take more time than we have to spare." "No way at all of cutting the time down?" "This isn't magic, Colonel," Farnsworth said. "You don't change a nobody into a physical and mental giant by saying abracadabra or by teaching him how to pronounce Shazam properly." "I'm aware of that," said the colonel without rancor. "It's just that I keep feeling that 5 years of work on Mr. Stanton should have taught you enough to be able to repeat the process in less time." Farnsworth repeated the head shaking. "Human beings aren't machines, Colonel. They require time to heal, time to learn, time to integrate themselves. Remember that, in spite of our increased knowledge of anesthesia, antibiotics, viricides, and obstetrics, it still takes 9 months to produce a baby. We're in the same position, if not more so. After all, we can't even allow for a premature delivery." "I know," said Mannheim. "Besides," Dr. Farnsworth continued, "Stanton's body and nervous system are now close to the theoretical limit for human tissue. I'm afraid you don't realize what kind of mental stability and organization are required to handle the equipment he has now." "I'm sure I don't," Colonel Mannheim agreed. "I doubt if anyone besides Stanton himself really knows." He looked at Bart Stanton. "That's it then, son. You're it. You're the only answer we found so far, and the only answer visible in the foreseeable future to the problem posed by the Nipe." The colonel's face seemed to darken. 10 years, he said in a low voice. 10 years that inhuman monster has been loose on Earth. He's become a legend. He's replaced Satan, the boogeyman, Frankenstein's monster, and mumbo-jumbo Lord of the Congo in the public mind. Read the news facts, watch the newscasts. Take a look at popular fiction. He's everywhere at once. He can do anything. He's taken on the attributes of the gene, the vampire, the ghoul, the werewolf, and every other horror and hobgoblin that the mind of man has conjured up in the past 500,000 years." "That's hardly surprising, Colonel," Bart Stanton said with a wry smile. "If a human being had gone on a 10-year rampage of robbery and murder, showing himself as callously indifferent to human life and property as you and I would be to the life and property of a cockroach, and if, in addition, he proved impossible to catch, such a person would be looked upon as a demon too. And if you add to that the fact that the Nipe is not human, that he is as frightening in appearance as he is in actions, what can you expect?" "I agree," said Dr. Farnsworth. "Look at Jack the Ripper and consider how he terrorized London a couple of centuries ago." "I know," said Colonel Mannheim. "There have been human criminals whose actions could be described as inhuman. But the Nipe has some touches that few human criminals have thought of, and almost none would have the capacity to execute. If he has time to spare, his victims become an annoying problem in identification when they're found. He leaves nothing but well-gnawed bones. And by time to spare, I mean 20 or 30 minutes. The damned monster has a very efficient digestive tract, if nothing else. He eats like a shrew. And if he doesn't have time, he beats them to death," Bart Stanton said thoughtfully. Colonel Mannheim frowned. "Not exactly. According to the evidence—" Dr. Farnsworth interrupted him. "Colonel, let's go into the lounge, shall we? Aside from the fact that standing around in an empty chamber like this isn't the most comfortable way to discuss the fate of mankind, this room is scheduled for other work." Colonel Mannheim grinned, caught up by the touch of lightness that the biophysicist had injected into the conversation. "Very well. I could do with some coffee if you have some." "All you want," said Dr. Farnsworth, leading the way toward the door of the chamber and opening it. "Or if you'd prefer something with a little more power to it." "Thanks, no," said Mannheim. "Coffee will do fine. How about you, Stanton?" Bart Stanton shook his head. "I'd love to have some coffee, but I'll leave the alcohol alone. I just have the luck to be finishing a drink when our friend the Nipe popped in on us. And when I do meet him, I'm going to need every microsecond of reflex speed I can scrape up." They walked down a soft-floored, warmly lit corridor to an elevator, which whisked them up to the main level of the Neurophysical Institute building. Another corridor led them to a room that might have been the common room of one of the more exclusive men's clubs. There were soft chairs and shelves of books and reading tables and smoking stands, all quietly luxurious. There was no one in the room when the three men entered. "We can have some privacy here," Dr. Farnsworth said. "None of the rest of the staff will come in until we're through." He walked over to a table where an urn of coffee radiated soft warmth. "Cream and sugar over there on the tray," he said as he began to fill cups. The cups were filled, and the three men sat down in a triangle of chairs before any of them spoke again. Then Bart Stanton said, "I made the remark that if the Nipe doesn't have time to eat his victims, he just beats them to death. And you started to say something, Colonel." Colonel Mannheim took a sip from his cup before he spoke. "Yes, I was going to say that, according to the evidence we have, he always beats his victims to death, whether he manages to eat them or not." "Oh?" Stanton looked thoughtful. "Oh, he's not cruel about it," the colonel said. "He kills quickly and neatly. The thing is that he never, under any circumstances, uses any weapons except the weapons that nature gave him, hands or feet or claws or teeth. He never uses a gun or a knife or even a club. Dr. Yoritomo has some theories about that which I won't go into now. He'll tell you about them pretty soon." Stanton thought about the Japanese scientist and smiled. "I know. Dr. Yoritomo has threatened to tell me all kinds of theories." "And believe me, he will," said Mannheim with a soft chuckle. He took another sip of his coffee and then looked up at Stanton. "You've been through 5 years of hell, Mr. Stanton. In addition, you've been pretty much isolated here. Dr. Farnsworth here has tried to keep you informed, but as I understand it, it has only been during the last few months that you've actually been able to absorb and retain information reliably. At least, that's the report I get. How do you feel about it?" Bart Stanton thought for a moment. It was true that he'd been out of touch with what had been going on outside the walls of the Neurophysical Institute for the past 5 years. In spite of the reading he'd done and the newscasts he'd watched and the TV tapes he'd seen, he still had no real feeling for the situation. There had been long, hazy periods during that 5 years. He had undergone extensive glandular and neural operations of great delicacy, many of which had resulted in what could have been agonizing pain without the use of suppressors. As a result of those operations, he possessed a biological engine that, for sheer driving power and nicety of control, surpassed any other known to exist or to have ever existed on Earth, with the possible exception of the Nipe. But those 5 years of rebuilding and retraining had left a gap in his life. Several of the steps required to make the conversion from man to Superman had resulted in temporary insanity. The wild, swinging imbalances of glandular secretion seeking a new balance, the erratic misfirings of neurons as they attempted to adjust to higher nerve impulse velocities, and the sheer fatigue engendered by cells that were acting too rapidly for a lagging excretory system, all had contributed to periods of greater or lesser abnormality. That he was sane now, there was no question. But there were holes in his memory that still had to be filled. He admitted as much to Colonel Mannheim. "I see." The colonel rubbed one hand along the angle of his jaw, considering his next words. "Can you give me, in your own words, a general summary of the type of thing the Nipe has been doing?" "I think so," Stanton said. His verbal summary was succinct and accurate. The loot that the Nipe had been stealing had, at first, seemed to be a hodgepodge of everything. It was unpredictable. Money, as such, he apparently had no use for. He had taken gold, silver, and platinum. But one raid for each of these elements had evidently been enough, with the exception of silver, which had required 3 raids over a period of 4 years. Since then, he hadn't touched silver again. He hadn't yet tried for any of the radioactives except radium. He'd taken a full ounce of that in 5 raids, but hadn't attempted to get his hands on uranium, thorium, plutonium, or any of the other elements normally associated with atomic energy. Nor had he tried to steal any of the fusion materials, the heavy isotopes of hydrogen or any of the lithium isotopes. Beryllium had been taken, but whether there was any significance in the thefts or not, no one knew. There was a pattern in the thefts and robberies, nonetheless. They had begun small and had increased. Scientific and technical instruments, oscilloscopes, X-ray generators, radar equipment, maser sets, dinostatic crystals, thermolite resonators, and so on, were stolen complete or gutted for various parts. After a while, he had gone on to bigger things. Whole aircraft with their crews had vanished. That he had not committed anywhere near all the crimes that had been attributed to him was certain. That he had committed a great many of them was equally certain. There was no doubt at all that his loot was being used to make instruments and devices of unknown kinds. He had used several of them on his raids. The one that could apparently phase out any electromagnetic frequency up to about 100,000 megacycles, including 60-cycle power frequencies, was considered a particularly cute item. So was the gadget that reduced the tensile strength of concrete to about that of a good grade of marshmallow. After he had been operating for a few years, there was no installation on Earth that could be considered night-proof for more than a few minutes. He struck when and where he wanted and took whatever he needed. It was manifestly impossible to guard against the Nipe, since no one knew what sort of loot might strike his fancy next, and there was, therefore, no way of knowing where or how he would hit next. nor could he ever be found after one of his raids. They were plotted and followed through with diabolical accuracy and thoroughness. He struck, looted, and vanished, and he wasn't seen again until his next strike. Colonel Mannheim, who had carefully puffed a cigar alight and smoked it thoughtfully during Stanton's recitation, dropped the remains of the cigar into an ash receptacle. "Accurate, but incomplete," he said quietly. "You must have made some guesses. I'd like to hear them." Stanton finished the last of his coffee and glanced at Dr. Farnsworth. The biophysicist was thoughtfully looking down at his own cup, his expression unreadable. "All right," Stanton thought. "He's looking for something. I'll let him have both barrels and see if I hit the target." "I've thought about it," he admitted. He got up, went over to the coffee urn, and refilled his cup. "I've got a pet theory of my own. It's just a notion, really. I wouldn't dare reduce it to syllogistic form, because it might not hold much water, logically speaking. But the evidence seems conclusive enough to me." He walked back to his seat. Colonel Mannheim was watching him, a look of interest on his face, but he said nothing. "To me," Stanton said, "it seems incredible that the combined intelligence and organizational ability of the UN government is incapable of finding anything out about one single alien, no matter how competent he may be. Somehow, somewhere, someone must have gotten a line on the Nipe. He must have a base for his operations, and someone should have found it by this time. I may be faster and stronger and more sensitive than any other living human being, but that doesn't mean I have superhuman powers, or that I'm a magician. And I'm quite certain that you, Colonel, don't credit me with such abilities. You don't believe that I can do in a short time what the combined forces of the government couldn't do in 10. Certainly, you wouldn't rely too heavily on it. And yet, apparently, you are. To me, that can only mean that you have another ace up your sleeve. You know we're going to get the Nipe fairly quickly. You either have a sure way of tracing him, or you already know where he is. Which is it?" Colonel Mannheim sighed. "We know where he is," he said. "We have known for 6 years." That's all for this time. Be sure to come back for another installment of Anything You Can Do by Randall Garrett.
That was read for us by Mark Nelson. If you missed any of the preceding chapters of Anything You Can Do, there is a link in the show notes, or you can go to the main website. Thank you, Mark.
As read by. Amazing stories read by amazing people.
This time on As Read By, we continue with the Growing Up series of stories from Tom Williams. This time, Tom tells us about hand-me-downs and flour sacks.
Growing up, but not forgetting. In a conversation with my cousin the other day, I mentioned about growing up poor and not knowing it. He said that where we lived, everyone was equally poor, and that's the reason we never noticed our status. I had 2 cousins of approximately the same age and size, and that was where I always expected my next article of clothing from. The good old hand-me-downs. Oh, with one exception, my grandmother. She could sew anything on that old sewing machine, powered by her 2 feet on the treadle. She mostly made the kids' shirts and shorts from flour sacks. Yes, I said flour sacks. You heard me right. Flour sacks. She bought her flour in large sacks, or bags if you want to call them that. The sack had different patterns and designs on them, and for us those days, we couldn't wait for the contents to be used up so we could get that next shirt made. Many of you ask why would a person buy so much flour at once? Well, in those days, the lady of the house always cooked and baked from scratch. The only prepared foods were canned goods and nothing frozen. Forget an idea of a microwave. Hours were spent in the kitchen. Grandmother would bake only on Saturdays and avoid as much work on Sundays. I think that's due to her religious convictions. Now, getting back to the hand-me-downs. Unfortunately, my brothers were too young for my hand-me-downs, so I was the end of the line for the clothing. Never knew where Mom passed my old clothes on to. I probably just wore them out. But then, nothing went to waste in our family. Even when a hog was slaughtered, every bit of that hog was used. Nothing there went to waste either. My uncle told me that even the squeal was turned into a song. Wasteful we weren't. There were things that we did wish for, though. For example, a Red Ryder BB gun or the unimaginable bicycle. Now, most bicycles those days, unless you got the luxury model, didn't have a chain guard to keep your pants leg from getting caught in the chain and sprocket. So you always had to roll up your right pants leg into a cuff. And naturally in my neighborhood, the cuff in the right pants leg meant you had status. You had a bicycle of all things. We could never afford a bicycle in my family, so I came up with a ingenious idea to always have a cuff in my pants. And when I went to school, I was the man of the hour for that day, and no one ever caught on to my deception. Mainly because we managed to move every 3 or 4 months. My cousin Fred got a bicycle one year. I couldn't believe it. He would ride me all over the neighborhood sitting on the handlebars. There was a turpentine plant near Grandmother's house, and it had a very steep hill that ended at the road below. And when you got there, you had to make an immediate turn left or right, or straight ahead into the ditch or into the woods. I remember sitting on the handlebar with bare feet on the left and right lug nuts of the front wheel. Starting at the top of the hill, Fred reminded me, "Watch your toes, Tommy," and would haul boogie, as he would say, down that hill at top speed, not slowing down even when he had to make a left turn to Grandma's house. He didn't have a bicycle bell, but I'm sure that everyone in the neighborhood could hear my scream the whole way down. Somehow we always made it home, and to this day I still have all my toes, thanks to Fred. This is your Watch Your Toes, Tommy, sincerely.
Thank you, Tom. One thing I never had to deal with was hand-me-downs. I was the youngest in the family for a very long time, and my older sister's clothes, well, just didn't suit me. Then my mom remarried and had my little sister. 8 years difference there, so no real passed-down possibilities. However, it was pretty cool having someone to protect, which I did at knife point on one occasion. Perhaps I can get my sister on to tell that story sometime. I think you'd like it. For those of you who don't know, Tom lives in Germany, was raised in the South, and has sent us these stories from his youth. You can expect to hear more of them in upcoming episodes. Thank you, Tom. Comes to an end. I want to thank our contributors this week, David Larson, Allie Frost, Tom Williams, Mark Nelson, and Stacy Myers. Each week you guys keep coming through with stories and comments, and I want you to know I appreciate it. If you want to follow the podcast or the blog, it's so easy to do. Just head to ronsamazingstories.com. There you will find all of the links you need. We are on Twitter, Facebook, iTunes, TuneIn, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and many, many other services. Pick one and do leave some feedback about the show. It really does help us to grow. Thank you for listening, and I hope you come again to find out what are Ron's Amazing Stories.
All of the vintage audio used in the podcast is believed to be in the public domain. Ron's Amazing Stories does not own the rights to any of the old-time radio used here. If you hold the rights to any of the shows played, please contact us immediately at ronsamazingstories.com.